If you've heard any of my talks or any time about anything I do, I talk about the smartest person in cybersecurity. That's this guy.
And I always usually say that Bryson doesn't know enough people.
Also true.
But anyway, I appreciate the intro. So I'm Sounil Yu, and I'm currently the CISO in residence at YL Ventures, and formerly the Chief Security Scientist at Bank of America. And today I'm going to share with you some perspectives I've had in actually running essentially what would be a purple team at Bank of America. So the role that I had as the Chief Security Scientist, you may wonder, like, what does a Chief Security Scientist do? Well, my general mandate was to drive perspectives and actions and technologies on, like, what is to be able to be ready for the next generation of threats, next generation of attacks, and to be able to have the right set of technologies and processes in place to be able to tackle those. And as a part of that, I actually had the opportunity to run the red team, the hunt team, and an R&D team, and to kind of provide some perspectives of how I look at the combination of these three teams. You essentially have the red team that's trying to get around all your different controls. You have the hunt team that's trying to find the red team. And then you have the R&D team that's basically trying to get bigger magnifying glasses and ways to close that hole in the wall, as well as to make taller walls, as well as to fill in the holes that you see on the ground. So the combination of those different teams, in some respects, was a progenitor, if you will, to I think what we currently call the purple team. We didn't call it the purple team back then, but it's essentially, it brought these different disciplines together. And what I did when I ran these different teams, I basically had them counterbalanced against each other. I created these metrics and these different goals for each team to be able to play off of each other. And so you see some of them here. Ryan's talk goes into much greater detail in terms of the different measurements and metrics that we can use. But in essence, for what I did, I basically said, look, the red team, your goal is to have the greatest dwell time in the world, the largest dwell time, and to be able to get in and go, or get back in as quickly as possible. The hunt team, of course, would be trying to find them, but more importantly, we want to operationalize the detections that they find, so that it's not just the hunt team that finds it, but also the blue team. So I didn't actually run the blue team. I ran what essentially fed the blue team the different detections that they should be incorporating into the infrastructure that we have. And then the R&D team, we tried to find the right countermeasures that prevented the red team from even getting in, and making sure that the hunt team had the right set of tools. Well, as I tried to work to improve our measurements here, for example, like lowering the dwell time or lengthening the time for reentry, what I discovered was that they all pointed me to something about what makes systems and infrastructure more defensible. And it's not what you might think. It's not what you might expect, okay? What you might expect is what is sort of represented here. So there's a lot of countermeasures that we can put forth. And to understand what countermeasures that might be needed, I created this framework called the Cyber Defense Matrix. It's one of the things that we want to avoid in security is a silent failure. But how do we know where a silent failure might occur? I mean, do we know what the attack space is? The Cyber Defense Matrix is something that I created to help me understand this attack space. It's basically a simple matrix that consists of two dimensions: the things that we care about, devices, apps, networks, data, and users, and the things that we do, and it's basically the NIST cybersecurity framework. And so this matrix helps me understand the attack space to be able to avoid silent failures, meaning if an attacker is able to attack one of these areas, then let's make sure that I have a control there to be able to address that. Now, I can fill this with a bunch of countermeasures and hunting tools, but does that really make a difference? Okay, does this actually move us towards defensible infrastructure? Because I think that's how I came in thinking that, sure, I put in all these things and that makes my infrastructure more defensible. But I've come to realize that there might be a better way to think about how we move towards defensible infrastructure. And as a way to think about it, I want to point to another model that my friend Josh Corman presented a while back. And he calls it the survival guide pyramid. And he gave this analogy around how we survive in a zombie attack. Okay, so if you want to survive in a zombie attack, you want to choose defensible infrastructure. You want to so if you have a structure that you can run to that's more fortified, then you want the defensible infrastructure. You want to have IT operational excellence. You want to make sure that the teammates that you have, you're asking if you're in the midst of a zombie attack, you want to know that if your teammates are going to get you killed or if you're going to be able to survive the night with your teammates. So that's what you want to have with operational discipline. You want to also make sure that you know what you have, know what changes. You want to have good operational hygiene. You don't want any unplanned changes. These are all things that are what we see in good IT operational disciplines. Next, you want situational awareness. You don't want to be fighting in the dark. You need light, you need visibility, you need to be able to hear these whispers, you need to be able to have a good understanding of what your environment is. So before you buy countermeasures, you want more visibility. You want to see stuff sooner and be able to act more promptly. And then lastly, in that context, now you look for countermeasures, okay? Now, the alternative approach is basically like an inverted pyramid. You build on indefensible infrastructure, and that requires more operational discipline. And usually what we get instead of operational discipline is we get operational confusion. We don't know what's going on. Changes happen and we have no idea what change happened and who did it. Indefensible infrastructure also requires more situational awareness, but oftentimes, again, we're left with situational blindness. And all this requires a lot more countermeasures. And this becomes very expensive and very prone to failure. So there's this concept that we have, again, with a zombie attack. If you're under a zombie attack, then you want to head towards defensible infrastructure. Now, again, when we hear that, we oftentimes think, okay, well, we want these fortified buildings, right? So imagine, go back to the old tale of the three little pigs. You want to choose a straw house, a wood house, or a brick house, or this fortress. And of course, we want to pick the fortress. But is that what defensible infrastructure is? Okay, I mean, sure, maybe in a zombie attack, in a physical world sort of thing, yes, I would like to have a fortress. But in the IT environments that we live in, is the fortress mentality the right mentality that we need to think through? And so I wanted to offer a different analogy to think about what is defensible, okay? And so we have the three little pigs and the fortress mentality, which we know tends to lend itself towards this perimeter concept and those sort of things. And we've been burned by that many times. So let me offer a slightly different analogy, and it's one that involves pets and cattle. All right, so pets and cattle. What's the difference between those two? So pets, those are things that you give it a familiar name. When it gets sick, you take it to the vet, and you like giving it hugs. So this is how we build systems, or how we've been building systems for a while. And these will look like your laptop, your personal laptop. These will be things like your social security number. And when it comes to traditional systems that are built in the traditional way, when it needs a patch, you, again, tend to it, you patch it, you fix it whenever it gets sick. Cattle, on the other hand, are things that you can't even pronounce the name of it because it's full of a bunch of different symbols and letters and characters. And when it gets sick, you just basically shoot it and you move on. And these are things like Docker containers and Lambda functions and credit card numbers that continuously change. Now, when it comes to this paradigm, I think it's important to be able to recognize the distinction between pets and cattle, especially as we think about what we do in risk management, because if we consider the risk management equation, the traditional risk management equation, we look at it as this product of likelihood and impact. But the problem is that when it comes to the likelihood side of the equation, we have a never-ending set of vulnerabilities that get worse over time. And we have this never-ending set of threats that only get better over time. So vulnerabilities get worse over time. Vulnerabilities age like milk. Threats get better over time. Threats age like wine. And the combination of those two is causing likelihood to go up. So the one thing that's really within our control is impact. And what we need to be able to do to reduce risk is to be able to drive impact down. And so the perspective here is a lot of what we consider to be defensible infrastructure and the tools and the capabilities that we put forth to defend our infrastructure is really to try to drive likelihood down. And that may be, over the long term, that may be a pretty difficult proposition. So what can we do then to look at the impact and to drive that down? And so with respect to that, I propose a new way to think about defensible infrastructure. And I would offer a different perspective called the DIE Triad. So the DIE Triad, DIE stands for distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. And when it comes to each of these different attributes, they confer various security benefits. So if it's distributed, it's resistant to any sort of DDoS attack. If it's immutable, it's easier to find changes, especially unauthorized changes. If it's ephemeral, it's really hard to maintain attacker persistence. So what I found was that when I considered the metrics for the purple team, sure, I wanted to be able to increase our ability to find or to shorten the amount of time it took us to find an attacker. And I can buy a bunch of hunting tools and whatever else it might be. Or I wanted to be able to make attacker persistence hard. So I try to find all these points of persistence and boot them out and so on and so forth. But I realized there might be actually a different way to tackle this problem. So I can put in, again, a bunch of countermeasures, and those countermeasures are oftentimes what we see as the CIA triad, or I can build towards DIE and not need as many countermeasures. Okay, so if I build towards the DIE triad, then I don't have to worry as much about the CIA triad. The perspective here is that they offset effectively each other. And if I build towards ephemerality, then I have a lesser burden or lesser need for confidentiality. If I build something that's more immutable, then I have a lesser need for integrity. If I build something to be distributed, then I have lesser needs for the availability of a given component. But more importantly, for the purple team, it actually helped me drive my metrics towards the direction I wanted, but without having to do more CIA. Okay, which was, I thought, really interesting, because we come in with, as a security professional, thinking, hey, we need to do more security stuff. We need to put in more countermeasures. But if we build towards more defensible infrastructure, but the type of defensible infrastructure that you see here, then our job actually becomes easier. And so when we look at CIA versus DIE, it's important to recognize that when it comes to our pets, we have to CIA them, okay? But when it comes to cattle, we can let them DIE. We build them to DIE. And when it comes to the attacks that we see, or when we have the red team come in and attack your pets, all right, well, you're gonna need a lot of countermeasures for those pets. And that may not be something that you can really avoid, because once you have a pet, yes, you are obligated to protect that pet. But cattle, on the other hand, who cares? Let the red team at it, let them take it over. I was gonna blow it away anyway. And so it's a different sort of perspective of how we think about the problem space. And when we look at it from that sort of perspective, we also have a different perspective of what our role might be within security. So if you're a veterinarian, well, generally you want people to have more pets, because that's going to be more lucrative for you. But consider how our goals may change if our goal is to actually try to reduce the number of pets, and we want to discourage or disincentivize pet creation. In fact, we not only want to disincentivize it, but we want to get people to actively reduce the number of pets that they have today. Okay. Now, getting rid of pets are hard. Once you have a pet, you kind of want the pet to live forever, which, you know, if you anybody who has a pet, you establish an emotional attachment to it, and then, well, you kind of want that pet to live for a long time. But ultimately, we have to decommission them at some point, get rid of them at some point. And so there's different ways that we can drive towards that. But we could also exercise better control as to what pets are created to begin with. And so anything that violates the principles of the DIE triad, we would then try to put in safeguards and controls that minimize the conversion of cattle into pets. Keeping in mind that one of the attributes of DIE is ephemerality. So if you do nothing, okay, if you do nothing, then you're starting to violate the principle of ephemerality, meaning this cattle that you built, if you do nothing, it will continue to live longer and longer. And at some point, it starts looking more and more like a pet. If you start modifying that cattle in place, if you even patch it in place, all right, it's starting to become more and more like a pet. And so what we want to think about is what kind of controls can we put in that let people know you're about to adopt a pet. And if you're willing to sign up to give this pet a lifetime of love, care, and attention, all right, more power to you, but just know that you're now obligated to take care of this pet forever. And if it runs out into the street, if it goes out into the street and it gets run over by a car, then the SPCA or the CCPA is going to come after you. So, you know, just putting you on notice that that's what's going to happen. But like I said, it changes our role from being just strictly a veterinarian to also being a pet control officer. And so as we think about where we're heading with respect to building or encouraging people to go towards more defensible infrastructure, it's getting people to build more cattle, but also preventing them from, or at least warning them before they start adopting more and more pets. And these are things that are actually very measurable as well. And so when it comes to using the purple team to drive people towards defensible infrastructure, we can see those statistics in terms of, at least I was able to see statistics in terms of their ability to maintain persistence in certain environments when those environments went away pretty quickly, right? And so one of the measurements that we can put forth here is this notion of, so if I use ephemerality as a metric, as a measurement, okay, I can do something like look at the uptime of all my systems and then determine which systems I have that are more pet-like and which systems I have that are more cattle-like. Those systems that have a longer lifetime tend to be more pet-like, and those that have a very short lifetime tend to be more cattle-like. I want if I'm going to try to drive my stakeholders towards having more cattle, then I want them to recognize that the red team attacking the cattle, and at the end of the day, it has very little impact, whereas the red team attacking pets have a lot of impact. Now, you may wonder, okay, well, what's a pet, what's a cattle here? And we can set an arbitrary time frame, just say, let's say 40 days, okay? And anything older than 40 days is a pet, anything younger than 40 days is cattle, and say, okay, we only have 500 pets, that's great. Well, maybe, it's great. 2.5% of our environment is pets. And if my team's large enough, we have enough vets for these pets that we have, all right? But I may not be comfortable 40 days. I mean, if you think about attacker persistence, 40 days is quite a long time to be able to have a lot of damage. So let's suppose I want to drive that down to 10 days, all right? But now I have 2,000 pets, and I don't have enough people to manage those pets or to be able to secure those pets. So let me now set new goals that push for fewer pets and shorter lived cattle. Let's set a target that says, look, let's try to keep, make sure that nothing becomes a pet without us knowing about it after 10 days. And let's try to get the number of pets down to something more manageable. And so again, this is another way to think about how we can represent, try to drive towards defensible infrastructure here. Now, you may also wonder, like, what do we mean by defensible infrastructure that aligns with DIE? And so I wanted to offer some thoughts there too, in terms of capabilities that we see that enable us to actually build towards DIE. And the cloud native world, or just infrastructure as a service providers, really already align heavily towards DIE. If you think about the cattle notion, the notion of cattle, pets and cattle actually came about when people were trying to describe how we should build things in the cloud. And so I have this adage that I say, which is pets on-prem, cattle in the cloud. If you're putting cattle in the cloud, that's exactly where it should go. If you're going to put a pet in the cloud, just take the necessary precautions so that you don't have that pet unprotected in the cloud. Okay, and it requires different types of protections, but know that you still need to CIA that pet, and CIAing that pet in the wild, out in the cloud, where it could potentially be very hazardous to that pet. If you're doing that not without the proper precautions, then that pet's going to get run over pretty badly. But cattle, on the other hand, you don't care. You build towards DIE for the cattle, and that's exactly how it should be built. And if that cattle gets run over or gets sick, again, you shoot it and you move on. And whether you're using AWS capabilities or there's a whole bunch of things within the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, lots of different tools, lots of different capabilities out there that will help you build towards DIE. All right, so the other perspective then to offer is, again, let's go back to the purple team. What can I do to be able to share with my stakeholders to say, let's build towards defensible infrastructure. Let's find ways where we can use the metrics from the purple team to, again, nudge people there. And I think I came up with this as a result of Bryce and our conversations around constraining the attacker space. I think I still have some minor divergences from how you think about it, but nonetheless, this perspective of how do we constrain the attacker space, right? But how do we actually even show that? I want to be able to show that here, right? Because I want people to see that, okay, we have, you can take the CrowdStrike report and show, according to CrowdStrike, we have all these different APTs attacking, being represented in the matrix here and saying, here's where all these attacks are emerging. And if you're going to build something using traditional web architectures, you have all this attack surface. But if you're going to build it using a serverless function, we've now eliminated significant parts of the attack surface. That is why we want you to go towards something like this, more defensible infrastructure. Bryson, you want to say something?
Yeah, no, so this came around the concept that I had that I first put out at a ShmooCon Fire Talk about going on 3 years ago, about the fact that the way that an attacker is constrained is that once they're in the post-access environment, so they pop shell, they're there, is that the code that they put down goes along 2 axes. It has to communicate and it's going to do things. So communications and capabilities. And communications is an inherently limited function because I'm constrained to the protocols that are in your environment, and there's only so many computer protocols, period. So that's a finite access. And then if we look at what they do is also going to be along a predictable line of an attack chain. Now, the challenge here starts to get into, if we're going into the market of, does it matter that I can turn that into a checklist, or does it matter if it's state-based? And so my hypothesis is that the attack chain across those axes has to be state-based, but it's a hypothesis. There's not been enough data along this research for anybody to definitively make that statement other than to conceptually argue it.
Well, so it's interesting you point that out, because one of the key attributes of this notion of DIE is that many of the assets that we see in DIE are actually stateless, right? And the more that you build off of stateless components, again, the harder it is for an attacker to attack it. And so again, it provides another way to constrain what the attacker, what you're exposing to the attacker as well.
Yeah, and that's what I like about your model, is it's the CISO's perspective of how do I look at my architecture and put it into these categories that help me prioritize and build natural processes for the defense of them.
That's right. And ultimately, again, moving towards what I would label as defensible architecture, or defensible infrastructure, but not defensible because you've put all these countermeasures on, but because you've picked the components that are, in my view, DIE-like. Now, defensible infrastructure is just part of it. I mentioned earlier that we also need to be able to pay attention to operational discipline and situational awareness. And so when it comes to operational discipline, one of the things that we want to be able to test in our red team is more than just popping a box. I mean, we've been there, done that. And frankly, there are a bunch of tools that can help us do that. And so I was thinking about, how do I really differentiate what the red team is supposed to do relative to all these other things that we see in the marketplace? And I run the danger of pigeonholing or marginalizing the red team here. Hopefully, or I run the danger of marginalizing a group of people who are sophisticated enough to go and attack me. But hopefully that this will make sense. So when I think about the different activities that we do, what I want to be able to ensure I have operational discipline in is all the different functions associated with identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover across all the different domains that you see. So I need to make sure that I'm exercising operational discipline throughout this entire process. Well, what is it that we test in each of those different cases then? What should I be asking the red team to do? Okay. What should I actually be looking at technology to do on my behalf? And if I am going to have some person do something, then what is it really that I'm asking that person to do? Okay. All right. So I was trying to think through that, and I came to this realization that in each of the different columns, if you will, of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, I'm actually testing something slightly different. So in the first column, we have tools that do vulnerability assessment. But my question is, what is it that we are actually testing? What is the control that we're testing? And I would argue that we're testing essentially configuration controls. Did we misconfigure something? Did we build something that was full of vulnerabilities, which shouldn't be built with vulnerabilities at all? Okay, I mean, controllable vulnerabilities, things that we know. Did we misconfigure it? Did we bake it in with vulnerabilities to begin with? And so the first set of controls would be a vulnerability assessment. Now, sure, I can hire somebody from Project Zero and have them find new vulnerabilities and so on and so forth. But the preponderance of this type of activity is going to be done by technology, where we know what to look for, and we just systematically, continuously look for it to make sure that we don't build systems that are misconfigured or have vulnerabilities that we know of. The next stage is testing then preventative controls. Now, if there are vulnerabilities that emerge, okay, what are we doing to make sure that those vulnerabilities are being addressed or being mitigated? And the whole notion of the way I would look at penetration testing is one of the common complaints that we have is asking for a pen test and just getting a vulnerability assessment, right? Like, that's not what I expected more. Well, what is it more that I'm expecting? I'm expecting to see whether or not that vulnerability is actually exploitable, okay? And that's it. Let's consider that to be the full scope. I don't need for you to go much more past the penetration portion. I just need to know whether or not a particular vulnerability is actually exploitable, okay? Whether or not a mitigation I put in actually mitigates, right? All right, then the next stage is detect. And here, what I'm testing, of course, are detective controls. And the question that I'm asking here is, if I know of a particular vulnerability or an issue that I can't fully protect myself from, at the very least, I want to know when something happens. And in particular, what I want to know is, does it get logged? Does it get logged and triggered such that it eventually appears in some analyst dashboard? Now, before an analyst actually sees it, I'm happy to suppress it because I don't need to necessarily create noise for that analyst, okay? And I think there's a bunch of breach and attack simulation tools that do that activity on a regular basis. And the purpose that I would put for it is really just to test these detective controls. Can I make sure that there's not a silent failure of a detective control, in that it doesn't get alerted, or the data doesn't get to the right place, and the analysts wouldn't otherwise see it. So that's the test that I want to do here for the detect side. And then last but not least is then the red team. And I put the red team here at the very end to say, okay, well, what is it that fundamentally I'm asking them to do? Am I asking them to pop a box? No. Am I asking them to find the latest ODay? No. What am I really asking them to do? I'm asking them to test our response controls. So in this case, I want an actual event to show up on somebody's dashboard, and I want to know, does the blue team actually respond to it? What do they do, right? And I want to be able to assess that and make sure that across all these different functions that we have operational discipline in how we configure, how we take preventative actions, how we make sure that our data detection engineering and data engineering activities are done right, and that our incident response and incident management processes are all happening properly as well. Okay, so all these processes that undergird our ability to exercise good operational discipline. And I think the red team is, the purple team as a whole, and the red team in particular here, is a key part of making that happen, making sure that we are actually exercising the right set of operational disciplines that undergird all these different processes. So that's operational discipline. And then lastly, situational awareness. We want to make sure that the hunt team has the information that they need to be able to find the activities that the red team would trigger, and that they know with a higher degree of certainty that this is something that is a legitimate issue. It's not a false positive. And so there's a lot of measurements that we can factor in here. Like, is the data there? How far does it go back? Does it answer the question that I have? And the goal here is not necessarily to just get deeper situational awareness in a given domain, but rather focus on getting the broader or more comprehensive view of situational awareness across as many domains as possible. That helps us eliminate false positives more quickly. And again, this is enabled through defensible infrastructure, because the type of systems that I'm talking about that are built to be DIE, they tend to already be well instrumented, because the visibility is actually an inherent part of how we manage and operate those systems. And so you build towards DIE, and we end up being able to support things like situational awareness. And again, it could be coupled with the activities that we do with the purple team to reinforce this notion that you build towards this more defensible infrastructure, and we gain more visibility as a result of that. So in summary, again, we should leverage these purple team metrics to be able to point stakeholders to defensible infrastructure. I would define defensible infrastructure as those things that have the qualities of being distributed, immutable, and ephemeral. Now, unfortunately, not everything is defensible, right? And so if you want to find a countermeasure for your pets, or what I would call indefensible infrastructure, then the cyber defense matrix can be useful to help you find those countermeasures. But it gets pretty expensive, right? And so I think that our best countermeasure is to avoid creating pets at all, or try to minimize that as much as possible, and instead promote cattle creation. And so with that, I throw out my statement: death to the CIA. I'm sorry, death to CIA, not the CIA. Death to CIA. Long live DIE.
For the American Intelligence Agency that's listening, that's Sounil you.
I said to CIA. Anyway.
We have a question here. Have you done any work on crosswalking this model to practices from different but potentially analogous domains like aviation or medicine or meteorology?
Meteorology, is that what I heard?
Meteorology, just crosswalking this to other domains, and those were examples that were offered.
That's the first time I've ever heard meteorology, but if you're referring to the DIE Triad, the answer is yes. And the hardest way to think about it is with physical manifestations, but it turns out to be a little easier than you think when we apply the right concepts to it. So let me apply a couple of physical manifestations. DIE versus CIA, okay, or pets versus cattle. Let's take fighter pilots, okay? Fighter pilots are pets, drones are cattle, okay? Let's apply that to energy infrastructure. Nuclear power plants are pets. Localized solar production would be cattle. Now, some of this and some of these analogies get a little harder when it comes to well, actually, so hopefully that makes sense. But one of the common questions I get is, well, what about data? Doesn't data seem like a pet all the time? And the answer is, well, sort of. But there's an interesting movement that's happening within the privacy ecosystem that is driving us to, that is penalizing people for having data pets and trying to encourage people to instead have data cattle. And ironically, the means by which we do that is through what's called privacy enhancing technologies, which has the acronym PET. But there's a whole bunch of privacy enhancing technologies that essentially allow us to, instead of building more data pets, to actually build data cattle instead. And these are things like secure multi-party computation, federated learning, homomorphic encryption, differential privacy. There's all these different technologies that are emerging right now that will help us do that too. All right, hopefully, I don't know if I answered the question properly, but that was how I would look at it.
Well, Bob didn't ask a follow-up on it, so we'll take that as a yes. I don't know if Ty and Eliza May are on.
Yes, I am. Sorry, I could not find the mute button. That happens when you've had quite a few gins. Fantastic talk.
Okay, thanks.
Cheers.
Is there a question? All right.
All right, everybody, we're going to be heading over to the main track for closing remarks. Sounil, again, I think you continue to hold the banner to the fact that I don't know that many people, and you're the smartest person I know in cybersecurity.
Thanks. I appreciate
Sounil, we have one more question.
Oh, okay.
Speaking of cows, how do you hire for your steak?
So Josh tells me that your sacred cows make the best hamburgers. And our sacred cows are not pets, right? So pets make the best hamburgers. I like it medium rare. Thank you.
Ah, me too. That was it.
So I have a question. You said your sacred cows make the best hamburgers. Are you intentionally saying hamburger versus steak?
Sure. No. It was a.
Because I thought that was even funnier, right? Like the best, your sacred cows make like the best steak, and it's like, oh, because it's a sacred cow, it's so delicious. But then to like on top of that, like turn it into a burger, which is just ground meat, where you're like, what's the point? That's why I was curious.
Burgers are amazing.
This shows why it's so important to always keep your stakeholders involved.
Ha.
Wink, wink.
Okay. I'll be sure to remember those puns for the next time I deliver this.
Dad unicorn.
All right. Anyway,
right.
Thank you for having me.
All right, everybody, in the executive track, we're heading over to the main track to join George and company. Sounil, good to see you again.